afternoon. My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at Pitt. It is my pleasure again to introduce yet another session of Charlemos, a very exciting series that we have had going since June. We hope that you enjoy it as well, and I will just hand it over to Javier Corrales, who will be moderating this discussion.
Welcome everyone. My name is Javier Corrales, and this is our fourth Charlemos. This is a Zoom webinar that we have created in order to highlight some of the new research that is being done on Latin American politics, and to be able to have a conversation with the authors and researchers. Today, we're going to talk about religion, sexuality, politics, and voting behavior in Latin America, which is the title of a paper by our two guests, Taylor Boas and Amy Erica Smith. Let me say something briefly about each of them before we start. Taylor is Associate Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at Boston University, and he has a PhD from UC Berkeley. He has been a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame, and a visiting fellow at the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. His book, Presidential Campaigns in Latin America, Electoral Strategies and Success Contagion, was published in 2016, and he's now working on a new book on the role of evangelicals in Latin America. Amy Erica Smith is Associate Professor of Political Science, as well as Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dean's Professor at Iowa State University. And in 2020-2022, she's also Andrew Carnegie Fellow, very distinguished. Her book on religion and Brazilian democracy, Mobilizing the People of God, was published just last year. It's fascinating to read about it, and she is a very good friend. That's how she, a family member of the LAPOP community, and her research is also being published in some of the most distinguished journals in our profession. Let's start. Welcome, Taylor. Welcome, Amy Erica. I want to, for those of you who haven't read the paper, there are so many things here, but one of the points that you make is that, you know, the cleavage that might have existed between Catholics and evangelical is disappearing, if it ever was strong. And instead, we're seeing a cleavage in Latin America that is getting activated almost as we speak between religious folks and non-religious folks. And that this is beginning to affect also party attachments. It seems that religion is back. And I'm wondering, let me start with this question. Are we really going back to the 19th century in Latin America, where one of the most important cleavages during most of the post-independence period was precisely attitudes toward religion between liberals and conservative? Are we going back to that era? What? Tell us about that.
So, like any good answer, it's yes and no, right? I think that there's a very real sense in which we are, you know, returning to an era in which religion has greater relevance in politics, like as you indicated in the 19th century, right? You know, there was a point in time in which the struggle between liberals and conservatives over the role of the Catholic Church in society and church-state relations was the defining cleavage. Then in the 20th century, we shifted to an era in which the class cleavage was much more determining of the structure of party systems and political conflict. You know, and now we are beginning to shift into an era, we argue in this paper, in which religion and sexuality politics are emerging as a cleavage, not necessarily replacing conflict over material interests, but at least coming up alongside it. I do think the way in which is different has to do with what you alluded to, whether there are intra-religious cleavages or cleavages between different religious groups in these different eras. back in the 19th century, the Protestant community was firmly on the side of the liberals and the defenders of the secular state, right? This was an era in which conflict between the Catholic Church and everyone else dominated the political agenda. Here's just one book that I grabbed off my shelf, Liberales, Protestantes y Masones. The Protestantes were on the side of the liberals and the Freemasons back in those 19th century battles. And so, and they were really a progressive community at the time, right? And so I think that's something important to understand, is that, something we emphasize in our paper, that evangelicals have not always been on the right. And the degree to which we identify them as being on the right now, in which they self-identify on the right, is very much related to the rise of sexuality politics on the agenda. And even, 2 decades ago, or even 1 decade ago in some countries, when these issues were not so dominant, that was not the case, and the political sort of implications of religion were distinct.
Okay, so let's go with that. What happened to progressive Christianity, either among evangelicals or even within the Catholic Church? I know your paper doesn't cover this, but tell us your own views on what has happened. Why are we seeing this shift to the right from evangelicals and also Catholic clergies?
Well, sure. Well, I'd say that progressive Christianity is still there. It hasn't disappeared.
Is it politically involved?
It is there as a minority movement. Yeah, it is a minority movement within Christianity among both Catholics and evangelicals. I would say that the progressive Christianity is a larger portion of Catholicism today, especially in some places like Brazil, where the Catholic Church is tended towards the left, than it is among evangelicals. But yeah, the progressive left is still there. The issue is that sexuality politics issues tend to cause a migration towards the right. Where's my right? This is my right. The sexuality politics issues tend to cause a migration towards the right among religious actors, and even many of the progressive religious actors of the progressive left tend to be more conservative on sexuality politics issues than anything else. So for instance, Marina Silva in Brazil, you're going to hear me talk a lot about Brazil today. But Marina Silva in Brazil is identified with the left. She's an environmentalist identified with the left. She's also evangelical. And this has been the one issue where she has just basically tried not to emphasize the issue, because it's very hard for her as a member of the left to take a position that is also consonant with her religious views. And so we find that progressives will tend towards the right, even on those sexuality politics issues when they're religious people. So the religious progressives will often feel this sort of tension between their socioeconomically leftist views and their sort of more conservative views on sexuality politics.
And I would underscore that, it's not just, I think, you sort of dig into this and look at the religious community in particular countries, and you identify cleavages among evangelicals, for example, where you've got a faction that was more involved in the struggle for human rights and against authoritarian regimes, right, during that period of particular Latin American countries, right? And some of them are kind of very unhappy with the direction that evangelical politics has gone. They may not personally agree with same-sex marriage or abortion, but they're much more committed to economic issues and social justice than they are to fighting battles in sexuality politics. And so they have a more sort of broad vision of what political priorities should be, but they've kind of been drowned out by the loudest and these days some of the most successful politicians that are pushing the sexuality politics issues.
Yeah, and I would say, Pope Francis would be an example of this. I think Pope Francis has been spun as more progressive than he is in some circles. His views on sexuality politics are not extraordinarily different from those of many other Catholic leaders, if one would, in terms of his like baseline views on abortion, he's anti-abortion, and he, you know, he would not be pro-gay marriage or any of those things. But I think where Pope Francis has had an effect in the Catholic Church is pushing for a higher, stronger emphasis, stronger issue salience of sort of socioeconomically progressive issues. So it's not that he's changed the Catholic Church's stance on gay marriage or abortion, but rather the salience that he gives to different issues.
Let me go back then to this question of one of the really interesting things that you do in your paper is that you show, I think it's one of the first papers that I see, that countries may not be discussing sexuality politics, but then the issue becomes salient and it gets discussed, and you have data to show when it becomes salient. And this really causes, would I call it, a bit of an earthquake in the electorate. Something really significant happens in the electorate the moment that we start talking about abortion rights, but especially it's mostly LGBT rights. Tell us what happens.
So it puts issues on the agenda that had not necessarily been discussed very much. I mean, I just think the pace of change in Latin America is so fast on these issues, right? I mean, I studied in Chile in the 1990s, and we had a gay couple in my program, and they were warned about, you know, sort of going out in the street and holding hands in 1997. And then in 2004, Chile legalizes divorce for the first time. And then in 2000, in the 2010s, you're seeing proposals for civil unions that are, being put forth by Sebastián Piñera, right-wing president. So just over the course of a very short period of time, things change very dramatically, right? And so this awakens religious groups that had not necessarily been paying much attention, at least in some countries where politics was much more conservative until recently. They were feeling fairly comfortable and sort of focusing on, their religious mission and not necessarily on politics, right? And so you see a reaction there. You also see, the left getting mobilized around these issues, right? And so you start to see conflict playing out in Congress, playing out in the streets and social media.
And but you also go further, if I remember. The public becomes very polarized. Some groups come out of the closet as being very pro-gay. They didn't know that they were very pro-gay. But other groups come out and discover that they're also very homophobic, or they start to state that publicly. Why is that? Can you say more about it? And that this is now a source of polarization and it's affecting political parties? Talk to us about that process.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so I think that we're not suggesting that these attitudes materialize out of nowhere, but that these attitudes may have long existed and just not been politically salient because there was no opportunity for these attitudes to be politically salient. I may hate, my husband's trying to get me to eat cricket bars, like candy bars made out of crickets. I might hate cricket bars, cricket candy bars. But if nobody is trying to force me to take a stance to vote on cricket candy bars, like my hatred for cricket candy bars is entirely off the issue agenda. So, so once cricket candy bars enter the agenda, then my latent disgust becomes electorally relevant. It is also possible that people who have never thought about homosexuality in the past suddenly develop attitudes on the issue. That does happen, I think, probably sometimes. But I would guess that by 2012, most members of the electorate had a position on homosexuality, on gay marriage, on abortion, things like that. They may have been attitudes that were electorally irrelevant.
And do you have any information about whether this new cleavage brought on by sexuality politics might also be producing defections from religious groups. I have a feeling that there are many Catholics who are becoming less Catholic, in part because of their disagreement with rejection of some of these issues. Is that happening? And is that also happening among evangelicals? I don't see it that much among evangelicals. Maybe you guys have seen it. Is it producing a flight away from existing religion and even maybe into irreligiosity?
So both Taylor and I, together and individually, have tried to figure this out, spent a lot of time trying to tease this out empirically. So to answer your question, in the US, it's very clear that this is happening, that political attitudes are causing people to sort themselves by religion, that religion has become endogenous to politics, to political views. Is this happening in Latin America? Possibly a little bit, but not nearly as much as in the United States. Of course, that's till now. We may, I mean, with this kind of intensifying political polarization by religion, we will probably see more of it happening in the future. So 10 years from now, will Latin America look more like the US in terms of endogeneity of religion to politics? Yeah, possibly. So in my book, I tried to tease this out, and I do find that it appears that Catholics are sorting a little bit on the basis of abortion attitudes. So Catholics who don't think that their church is conservative enough about abortion switch churches to find another church that's more conservative on abortion attitudes. It hasn't happened a ton up until now. But it could happen. In theory, it should happen.
Yeah, maybe look,
should, but the theory would say that it will happen.
Yeah, for our Latin American Research Review article on opinion congruence in Latin America, and it looked at congruence along a number of descriptive representation categories, including gender and race and so on. But we also looked at religion. We addressed this question of whether it seems like people are converting, right? Are like, is our political attitudes driving religion, not the other way around, right? You're conservative, so you become evangelical and start attending a church that matches your pre-existing views. And I don't know, I don't think we conclusively hit the nail on the head, but we didn't find tons of evidence that that was happening. It seems like people are converting for other reasons. I do think that there's a growing tide of non-affiliation too, right? I mean, that's quite clear in the survey data over time in the countries that measure religion in the census, and that is being, driven by attitudes, by more secular or liberal positions that clash with the conservative stances that some churches are taking, right? And then you do have a teeny tiny slice of kind of progressive evangelicalism. I know like a handful of gay evangelicals in Latin America that typically like grew up in the faith and, were sort of deeply committed to it in their childhood. They have fathers who were pastors, whatever, right? And they sort of growing up try and reconcile who they are with who they were, and they found, progressive Christian communities and march in the gay pride parade and that kind of thing. But they're very small.
Let me ask one more question, and we're going to turn to some of the questions that we have been getting. This is a question about political parties that are center-right. In the 1990s, there was the hope, I thought there was the hope, that we could see in Latin America the rise of strong center-right parties that were going to be a bit more secular. Very interested in economic efficiency, discussions about globalization and competitiveness, but not necessarily gravitate towards socially conservative issues and certainly not become confessional. It seems that hope is over. It seems that if you want to be competitive on the right, it would be foolish for you as a political party not to try to capture this new cleavage that you guys are talking about. Do you agree with that? And if so, isn't that a bit difficult and challenging for democracy that we're seeing the non-possibility of secular, moderate, center-right parties in the region?
I think it varies by country. I'll turn again to Chile, where, Sebastián Piñera was the one that, introduced civil unions legislation, right? Michelle Bachelet ended up being the one that enacted it because his term had ended. But, Piñera recently, signed the transgender rights law in Chile. And so he kind of plays more of a social conservative during campaigns, but ultimately, like, I think he is an example of this, business right that is not right wing on sexuality politics. He's more conservative on abortion. And you've got Evópoli, which is this Evolución Política that is a splinter in Chile off of Renovación Nacional, right? And they are in support of same-sex marriage and more liberal on these issues. So in some places like Chile, you do. Jump in, Amy Arca?
Yeah. So I would say that the problem is not the elites. The problem is what is politically, what is saleable in mass electoral politics. I think that what we see happening right now in Brazil is incredibly interesting, and so I'll clarify that in a moment, and suggest that that it may be hard, at least in a country such as Brazil, to mobilize a sort of a center-right secular party. So what we see happening right now in Brazil is that Jair Bolsonaro has discovered that the emergency basic income programs that were authorized temporarily during the pandemic boosted his approval rating by up to about 10 percentage points. So Jair Bolsonaro had run as a fiscal and social conservative. He is rapidly migrating over a period of a few months. He was always a fiscal conservative, basically by expediency, because this was the constituency that he thought could get him elected. So he was never really committed to his fiscal conservative bona fides. He appointed Paulo Guedes as his economic minister, basically to borrow legitimacy from somebody who was a true fiscal conservative. So he has suddenly embraced social spending, dramatic social spending, while continuing to be a social conservative. So what we may end up seeing in the Brazilian case is somebody who is fiscally, I don't know if progressive is the right word, or liberal, but fiscally much looser with the pocketbook than one would ever have thought that he was going to be, while continuing to be basically anti-gay and really highly socially conservative in lots of ways. And this looks like it could be a very electorally saleable package. To give him a lot of staying power.
So, okay, and Erica, this is really amazing, because basically what you're saying is, no, we will not see a fiscally conservative, socially liberal center-right in Latin America for now. If Brazil is any indication of the future, that we're going to see basically, developmentalism with social conservatism. And this is the wave of the future. Brazil is telling us where we're heading, right?
Well,
or is it very bad countries?
One of the other things that, we talk about in this inclusion. One of your other questions that you mentioned you might ask was with respect to how do we reconcile growing tolerance with growing conflict and cleavages, right? So I'm sorry if I stole that one from you can ask later, but there's this really interesting paper by Lucas Chiabreo Maya and Lucas Chiabreo Maya, Albert Chu, and Scott Desposato, and it's a working paper, and I saw this presented a few months ago, and they show that tolerance increases, right? So support of things like same-sex marriage or other LGBTQ rights grows after policies are enacted, right? And, I think we've seen, without being a specialist in the United States, I think we've seen similar things happen here as well, right? The policy that everybody was warning would bring the apocalypse is enacted. It doesn't actually bring about the apocalypse, and then people re-equilibrate. And so, you also have that trend, right? And that is, shifts in public opinion can empower new political parties and new political actors. I'm not going to project forward Jair Bolsonaro and say that's the future of all of Latin America, right? I really think this is going to vary dramatically by country, as it always has, right? I mean, the pink tide wasn't pink tide everywhere. The conservative counter reaction wasn't that either, right? I mean, there's quite a bit of political variation across the region.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to start to think about under what conditions we're going to see the Brazil route versus the perhaps a Costa Rica route, where there is the possibility of more of a fiscally conservative party that is somewhat secular. We have a few questions that are starting to come in. Let me bring in two into the discussion. One has already been covered. It's by Isabel Castillo, and I have one from Vicky Murillo. The first one, what happens once the cleavage is activated by the discussion of a particular sexuality policy? We talked a little bit about it, but let me ask you to go back to that and maybe perhaps make the distinction between talking about gay marriage, casamiento igualitario, or abortion. Is there a difference between these two things? That's one question. Let me raise the question that Vicky has sent us. What is the impact of international diffusion? Since this is not just a Latin American phenomenon that we're seeing, could there be an international variable here for us to think about? Let's take those two, and we'll go back to more questions later.
All right, so I'm not sure that I entirely understood the question about what's the difference between abortion, how do abortion and homosexuality work differently, but I think you're asking, do they activate slightly different cleavages?
Yes, yeah,
So yes, they do activate somewhat different cleavages. So this is something that I had found in my prior research focused on Brazil, and that then replicates really well cross-nationally in this paper, that on homosexuality, we find a pretty serious cleavage between evangelicals and Catholics, where Catholics are substantially to the left of evangelicals on basically anything related to sort of gender and sexuality, or gender and like homosexuality issues or LGBT issues. And then on abortion, we find evangelicals and Catholics together on the right, together on the right, and with them substantially removed from progressive or non-religious voters. So yeah, there are two different cleavages really in the electorate.
I think one way to think about this question is, once like there's a proposal to legalize same-sex marriage and gets debated, and maybe it succeeds or maybe it fails, like is that issue driving political conflict going forward, right? I mean, these are particular policy battles that happen, and sometimes the progressives win, sometimes the conservatives win. And then sometimes those particular issues are kind of off the table, right? I mean, the same-sex marriage is legalized in Brazil. Like that hasn't been the defining battle, for the remaining 5-6 years in Brazilian politics, right? So, in a certain sense, like, yes, these things pop onto the agenda, and then those particular issues may come off. But I think the broader package, so they're no longer fighting over same-sex marriage. The courts have decided that, but now, it's the whole ideologia de género package, right? Mm-hmm. That they include specific issues such as the curriculum used in public schools with respect to gender and sexuality, right? And so, new issues are transgender rights. I mean, you have seen this in the United States as well, right? Like we're not, now battling over same-sex marriage, right? Mm-hmm. But new issues have arisen that are kind of at the forefront of the battle, right? So I think that gets at this question of what happens when particular issues subside. And then Vicky's question was about international diffusion. America, you want to?
Sure. Okay, so international diffusion. I think Vicky, I don't get a chance to ask her to elaborate, but I think Vicky's probably asking, we can think of international diffusion both within religious movements and within sort of left-leaning social movements. And international diffusion is happening from both on sort of like progressive, sort of pro-LGBT and abortion rights kind of movements, and also within religious groups. So yes, both left and right, both religious groups and progressive groups are engaged within international arenas and within sort of networks of international organizations and church organizations, religious organizations, that influence their adoption of these frames and the ways that they decide to respond to other actors. So yeah, this is, there's constant dialogue and feedback going on. And at the same time, Taylor and I have spent a lot of time talking about this individually and together, that we want to push back on the notion that this is all sort of imposed from the outside. I don't think that Vicky is suggesting that, but we do want to make that clear that we don't believe that this is being imposed from the outside. On the one hand, yes, pro-LGBT movements and, say, Catholic groups in Argentina or Brazil are taking frames and strategies from international groups, and at the same time, they're adopting and appropriating these strategies in new ways that are using local vernacular and based on real local concerns.
You also have some South-South diffusion, right? I mean, the, Con mis hijos no te metas, movement, particularly active in Peru. And its organizers there have been traveling around Latin America and even around the world. I interviewed its organizer, and he was talking about having recently been in Paris, right? So you've kind of got this like the old world traveling to the secular new world to try and, mobilize religious conservatives there. And so it's not just, we don't see this as a phenomenon whereby the religious right in the United States or the progressives in the North inject their ideas and their methods into the South.
Yeah, I would say that one really interesting small sign of this that you see is differences in ideology, sort of frames and use of language between Latin America and the United States. So for instance, the term gender ideology, ideología de género, or ideología de género, is a term that is really used by conservatives, by religious conservatives in Latin America, and doesn't really translate very well into English. It's not, it is a term, it is a buzzword that has a different cultural meaning in Latin America. And it's because it has diffused very broadly through South-South diffusion networks among the right in Latin America. And you don't see it in the United States in the same way. And it's because even though there is tons of diffusion happening, it's just not, it's not perfect. There's diffusion, but there are barriers too.
Okay, great. Well, awesome. Let me see. We have 2 more questions. How about if I do the same thing of try to articulate both simultaneously, and then we'll take them from there. This one comes from Marcela Tanaka. She's from Brazil, PhD candidate from Brazil. She's curious about how exactly these issues of sexuality politics enter the political agenda and resulting media coverage. What happens? So I think perhaps the question is, what might differentiate in Latin America at the moment a country that has been able to embrace the issues of sexuality and the ones that are lagging behind? And there's some that really are less involved in these debates. So that's one question. And then we have another question from Scott Morgenstern, and he has a question regarding the interrelation of ideology and religion with respect to different issues. How are these new religious divisions affecting political divisions regarding traditional class issues and pro-poor policies?
She said, what's causing the increased salience, if not, postmodernization? The postmodernization argument is that you kind of have this gradual value change that goes along with increases in well-being, and so societies don't have to worry so much about meeting their material needs, and so they can be more altruistic, and along with that altruism comes greater tolerance of difference, and so we start to think that same-sex marriage is okay because societies are becoming more affluent, right? We see a really more punctuated process whereby the actions of elites, we emphasize, place these issues on the agenda. In many cases, they're judicial elites, right? Sometimes international, such as in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Other times domestic, such as the decisions by the Colombian high courts in the 2000s, or by the Brazilian courts with respect to first same-sex civil unions and then same-sex marriage in 2011 and 2013. Other times you have the legislative process, right? All of these actors, to the extent that we have elite data, survey data of legislators' attitudes and political elites' attitudes, are much more progressive on sexuality politics than the public, right? And so when they act, oftentimes they push policy in a more progressive direction, and it's abrupt, right? It's not simply the product of the slow evolution of societal attitudes that comes along with modernization.
My sense is that social movements in general are probably necessary for getting things like pro-LGBT rights, abortion rights, things like that, onto the political agenda. That said, the way society responds and the way legislators respond, I think, is influenced by underlying distribution of opinion in the electorate. So when a coalition of pro-LGBT social movements and legislatures manages to get a major shift in the favor of direction of protection of LGBT rights passed through the legislature, I think what we see is, in some contexts, that can cause a backlash. But backlashes are never inevitable. It's a question of the underlying distribution of public opinion that would respond to that change.
And then remind me, what was the other question, Javier?
Interrelation of ideology and class issues.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah. Do you want to address that one?
Sure. So let's see, to repeat Scott's question, Scott was asking, how do we anticipate that the rise of new sexuality politics issues will affect old time materialist cleavages? I would say, I think Taylor may have, this is something that Taylor and I haven't spent a lot of time talking about, and he may have a different take on this than I do. What I see is that materialist issues aren't going away. So on the one hand, Taylor and I are arguing that there is a realignment around sexuality politics issues. And on the other hand, we're not saying that materialist issues, this is not a what's the matter with Kansas, all of the, an issue of people voting against their material interests. So, for instance, Jair Bolsonaro, we talked about this realignment with Jair Bolsonaro. He's realigning his own political stance on fiscal policy to meet the materialist needs of a certain pocket of the electorate. So I don't see inequality issues going away in Latin America. I see this as an additional issue that is increasingly entering the scene and not replacing it. Will it eventually go away? It's possible. I think we might need a different media environment in order to make that possible.
I would agree with that. I think there are structural obstacles to, what has happened in the United States, where you've got this kind of coalition, and I just read recently the new Pearson and Hacker book, Let Them Eat Tweets, right? And so they argue you've got this coalition between the nativists, the Christian conservatives, and the plutocrats, right? I think there are structural obstacles to that because the Christian conservatives aren't that wealthy in Latin America, right? Or the you know, in particular the evangelicals, you know, this is a movement that's growing most rapidly among the lower, you know, socioeconomic strata, right? And so they're a religious minority, and in most countries they're poorer, and less white, et cetera, right? And so, you know, and you really do have some successful politicians that are on the right, but have basically suppressed their preferences for redistributive policies because they care more about abortion and gender ideology, right? So, you know, I think there's kind of this tension within some of the Christian conservative communities between a stronger preference for left-wing economic policies than you see in the United States among their counterparts in the US.
Let me follow up on that because it's a fascinating question. Could you address the question of that these two cleavages are no longer, are not only coexisting, but maybe in competition with each other? Let me explain what I mean. There's a lot of theory saying that for you to be able to make progress with sexuality politics, you have to somehow migrate to post-materialist values. The evidence is not that strong, but there is something to that. And you see it in Latin America. There are a lot of people, for example, I have talked to a lot of LGBT activists who, when trying to make their cause more palatable, they always get the, you know, that's a bourgeoisie thing, or just get married and let's talk about materialist issues. And so there might be a bit of a competition, at least in occupying the space. And so this is depressing for Latin America precisely because materialist issues haven't been settled and in fact have gotten especially terrible in 2020. We may be facing many years of obstacles to further progress on sexuality politics. What do you say about that?
I mean, that's kind of in some ways the Engelhardt and Welzel argument.
Yep.
I mean, they say that sort of economic decline is likely to cause kind of a regression back into material concerns and the suppressing of the post-materialist ones. I don't know. I'm not sure that we've seen evidence of, you know, the progressives are winning these battles in Latin America compared to Africa, right?
Yes.
And,
through courts,
yeah,
and
Well,
legislation.
I mean, in allies, I mean, the
in
courts
places.
are, you know, effectively, it's
Right.
a signal of the of some kind of public support. I mean, the
True,
courts
that is
are
true. And so that's the
an
one
elite
opportunity
support
that we
for
have.
these issues. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
mean, I don't see tons of evidence around the region of even really much evidence of reversion, right? I mean, I don't think Amy, Eric, and I know the specific details of every single country. There may be people on this call that could point out counterexamples, but you know, for the most part, you know, rights once they're granted remain. I don't know. Do you?
I love this optimism. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, I would say that, do we see reversion on these issues? Abortion opinion is polarizing, at least in Brazil. I don't know what it's doing across Latin America. So, but that was an issue that was, there was never legal progress made on abortion, or not much legal progress made on abortion in Brazil. So, yeah, I mean, we see these things, I mean, we see vehement fights over these issues, but we don't see a lot of backtracking on these issues, which is not necessarily to say that there will be a ton of progress.
They're secured, yeah. Good. Okay, we have a couple more questions and we're running out of time, so let me try to get them to you as quickly as possible. One is from Denisa Contreras. In what context could new denominational parties play a relevant role? And the second question is, I know this paper didn't, your paper didn't talk about this, but any guesses on what might be the effect of candidates' sexual orientation on vote choice? I love this question. Let me just give you a little bit of context. I find it remarkable that the LGBT movement in the region, even where it is very strong, is devoid of a lot of openly out LGBT politicians. But we do get them more so than ever. And do we know what happens to the electorates? How do they respond? Okay.
El
yes.
Alcalde
Can
Pedro
I
is not very active in Latin America, right?
Can I answer the candidate question first?
Sure.
Largely just because I want to talk about the great dissertation being written by Facundo Sages Kobylanski from Argentina, or from Vanderbilt. Facundo is working on a dissertation right now. He has studies in the field that are going to produce really interesting work on he's conducting conjoined experiments to try to see how candidates' LGBT status combine with other traits to affect voter discrimination against LGBT candidates. So this is pushing the literature. So to the first question, are LGBT candidates discriminated against? Yes. That seems pretty clear from qualitative and quantitative data, a little bit of research that, for instance, I have run survey experiments in which I say, X candidate is engaged in the pro-LGBT movement, which is not the same as saying that they're gay, but it's similar. And yes, people discriminate against them. Not a big surprise. But I think the more interesting question is under what circumstances do they discriminate against these candidates?
So I respond to Denise's question about new denominational parties. So, Chile is a good example that we can contrast with a place like Brazil, right? So the party system in these countries really places restrictions on what these possibilities are for, organizing new political parties, right? And so, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God basically has its own political party in Brazil, right? The Assemblies of God, attempted to organize one, although ultimately weren't successful in doing it. In Peru, there have been, numerous attempts to establish new evangelical political parties. Most of them have actually not been successful, although there have been some that have been founded and had some successful candidates for office. And in Chile, there have been, a series of efforts only very recently, right? This was a political party system which was very restricted for a long time. It's beginning to open up over the past, 7 years or so. But, even the details of the new party registration requirements, have significant implications for whether, efforts to establish new religious political parties are going to be successful, right? And so I think to date, outside of Brazil, where the Brazilian Republican Party that's associated with the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God has been fairly successful, you haven't seen religious conservatives coming to office through religious parties as a major phenomenon. Even in Mexico, they got a lot of attention with the Partido Encuentro Social that allied with AMLO during the campaign, right? They elected very few, they got very little vote, elected very few legislators and lost their party registration because they didn't go above the threshold, right? And so that hasn't been the major route to office for Christian conservatives.
I just want to ask one final question, and so that we can wrap this up. And sort of like, let's leave the details. And many of us, at least I am a person who, when I teach about Latin America, I always have my standard section on religion in Latin America. Can you tell us, how is it that the rest of us political scientists who might not be specialists on religion and politics, why should we keep thinking about this topic, and what new nuances would you say, I know if I even have to repeat something, maybe one or two takeaways for us to have about what's new and what's not that new about the study of religion and politics in Latin America?
Can you go first?
Okay, sure. So there are a whole bunch of questions all embedded in one there. But why should you care about religion? Because religion, it's an extraordinarily multifaceted dimension of society. It is the most commonly attended civil society organization in Latin America. By far more people participate in churches and church-related organizations than participate in any other form of civil society organizations out there. So if you want to understand what's going on in civil society and in terms of organization among people, you have to understand what's happening in churches. And at the same time, it is not just simply, it's not just a club. It's not just a civil society organization. It is the most important club, but it's not just that. It is also an ideology, a set of beliefs, a method of socialization of those beliefs. So all of these things together make religion potentially extraordinarily powerful in people's lives, and something that we really need to understand in order to understand politics and how politics happens at the citizen level. What one takeaway should you take from this? I think that what Taylor and I are both trying to communicate here in this paper is that the implication of religion for politics is extraordinarily contextual. That religious doctrine, anybody who tells you that religion says gays are bad has not been thinking very, very hard about religion or any other single take-home message. So religious doctrine, the Bible, for instance, says an extraordinarily diverse number of things, and communities take texts and interpret them. And so interpretive communities are extraordinarily important and means of diffusion. So at present in Latin America, we do see a lot of religion being on the political right, but this is a contextually determined phenomenon and not something that will necessarily be here forever. But we do need to understand what's happening in order to understand the religion, in order to understand politics in Latin America.
And I would just add, Javier, you asked, what's the new thing that we add to that section of the syllabus on religion, right? If that section of the syllabus was like, oh, in the 19th centuries, there were liberals and conservatives in battles over separation of church and state, and then the constitutions did that, and then you had some progressive Christianity with Vatican II and liberation theology, and then the churches did some things with respect to authoritarian rule. Sometimes they were opposed, sometimes they were complicit, and then here we are now, right? And so if anybody adds what's new is the socially conservative evangelicals. And I would say, let's be a little more nuanced in our treatment of that new phenomenon, because evangelicals are not simply socially conservative. They're not simply right-wing. They're not simply Spanish or Portuguese speaking versions of their counterparts that those of us who live and work in the United States see here. Right? It's a movement that's sort of fascinating in terms of its differences as well as its similarities and its history, right? I mean, there's a dissertation by Matthew Casey that I read recently talking about the history of Protestantism in Peru, where he said, in the leftist political imaginary, Protestants were the model religious minority circa 1920 to 1940. And so there's this history of being very progressive, pro-indigenous rights, right, against the conservative forces in society, which were, the Catholic Church and the elite. And this continued really up into, as late as the 1990s, up until sort of the eve of some of these sexuality politics battles coming on the horizon. You had, when church state, issues were bigger in some countries, you had evangelicals more to the left, right? And so, dig a little deeper into the diversity and some of the interesting conflicts, internal conflicts within this political community.
All right, that's really all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you, the two of you, congratulate you, Amy, Erica, and Taylor, on such a great paper and your interest in this topic. Everyone who was able to join us, to listen to us, thank you very much. I want to make sure before we say goodbye that you should be able to see the announcement for our next Charlemos. It's going to take place, usually we do it every 3 weeks, so September 21st. The time is different, 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to talk about a new book, Vote, Drugs, and Violence, Mexico and Beyond, co-authored by Sandra Ley and Guillermo Trejo. Again, thank you, Amy, Erica. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, the University of Pittsburgh team, for organizing this. And goodbye, everyone. It was a pleasure.